Good afternoon. My name is Christopher Ramirez, and my project is titled Transgender Muslims, Faith, Identity, and Interpretation. In this presentation, I explore how transgender Muslims navigate faith, identity, community, and interpretation. Rather than approaching this topic as a simple conflict between region and identity, I focus on how meaning is shaped through interpretation, lived experience, and context. I hope you enjoy this presentation. This slide introduces the guiding questions for my project. As the slide states, transgender Muslims are often discussed as if faith and gender identity must conflict. But instead of starting from that assumption, I focus on what changes when we look at interpretation, authority, and lived experience. So I ask, how do transgender Muslims explain faith and identity to themselves, their families, religious leaders, and the state? This question is important because identity is not only personal, it is something that has to be understood and recognized by others. I also ask why Muslim communities and countries reach such different conclusions from shared religious traditions. This helps move away from the idea that Islam has one fixed answer. And finally, I ask who gets believed when Islamic ethics are turned into law, medical policy, or community practice. So as this slide emphasizes, the key question is not only what does Islam say, but who is allowed to interpret Islam, and with what consequences. This slide presents the main argument of my project. As shown here, I argue that responses to transgender Muslims are not determined by Islam itself, but by how Islamic sources are interpreted within specific histories, cultures, and political systems. The slide also emphasizes that Islam is a dynamic ethical tradition, not a single fixed answer repeated everywhere in the same way. This is important because it reframes religion as something that is lived and debated, rather than something static. Debates over transgender identity reveal diversity within Muslim communities, especially in how scripture, medicine, law, and social belonging interact. And as the slide highlights, this central ethical issue is whether interpretation becomes a tool of exclusion or a path toward dignity. So ultimately, transgender Muslim experiences reveal not a lack of faith, but a struggle over religious authority and meaning. The Quran is a central text for Muslims, but it does not directly name modern categories like transgender identity. That absence is important because it means communities must interpret broader ethical ideas like justice, harm, modesty, and human dignity. The slide also points out that different interpreters emphasize different verses, hadith, and legal principles when discussing gender variance. In addition, classical categories like kunta and mankuntas do not map neatly onto modern transgender identity, which creates further complexity. So as the slide concludes, Quranic interpretation is never just about the text alone. It is shaped by history, legal traditions, and social concerns, and ethical imagination. This helps explain why there is so much variation in how transgender identity is understood across Muslim communities. This slide builds on that idea by focusing on historical context. As the slide shows, Keisha Ali's work is important because she demonstrates that Islamic legal rulings develop within specific social words. Many classical rulings reflected assumptions about gender roles, family structures, and social order in their own time. The slide also emphasizes that not all rulings are timeless, which is a key point. Recognizing historical context allows Muslims to ask whether inherited interpretations still produce justice today. This opens space for reinterpretation. So instead of seeing reinterpretation as a rejection of Islam, Ali's argument suggests that it can actually be a part of engaging seriously with their tradition. I now introduce Scott Kugel's perspective as an example of an affirming scholarly approach. As the slide explains, Kugel begins with the Quranic ethics like mercy, justice, and human dignity. He argues that diversity in creation can be understood as part of divine wisdom rather than as moral failure. The slide also points out that his approach asks whether exclusion causes harm and whether dignity is being protected. This is important because it creates an Islamic argument for inclusion from within the tradition itself. And as the slide emphasizes, Kugel's work shows that affirming transgender and queer Muslims does not require abandoning Islam, but instead involves rethinking how Islamic ethics are applied. Now, not all interpretations are affirming. Some scholars argue that gender tradition violates the created order, while others permit it only under strict medical conditions. These positions often frame gender transition as either changing God's creation or as a medical necessity that must be carefully regulated. The key point is that this disagreement itself supports my thesis. Islamic authority is not unified but plural and contested. And as the slide concludes, the debate is not between religion and no religion, but between different ways of defining nature, harm, necessity, and dignity within the same tradition. This slide introduces Iran as a central case study for my project. As the slide explains, Iran shows that legal recognition of transgender identity can exist within an Islamic state. However, that recognition comes through medicalization and state control, rather than full freedom. It highlights how identity becomes legible through diagnosis, certification, and legal procedures. For example, institutions like the Tehran Psychiatric Institute play a role in determining who is recognized as a transgender. The concept of truthfulness, which the slide mentions, shows how individuals must prove their identity to experts and authorities. So, Iran complicates common assumptions. Recognition and restriction exist at the same time. Being recognized by the state can also mean being controlled by it. This makes it a powerful example of how religion, law, and power intersect. Najmabadi describes it as a snakes and ladders dynamic, which is really useful for understanding how progress works in this context. This slide shows that increased visibility allowed transgender individuals to become recognized by the state and by medical institutions. This visibility helped some people name their identity and access resources like legal recognition, healthcare, and documentation. But at the same time, that same visibility also made transgender individuals more legible to the state, which meant they became subject to monitoring, regulation, and institutional control. This highlights that activists often focus on concrete needs like medical care, financial support, legal recognition, and protection from harassment, rather than abstract rights. That distinction is important because it shows how survival and stability were more immediate concerns than broader political recognition. So when we think about the snakes and ladders imagery, it really captures how progress is not linear. Each step forward, like recognition or visibility, can also create new limitations or forms of control. This directly supports my thesis as well, because it shows that outcomes are not determined by religion alone, but by how religious interpretation interacts with institutions like the state and medicine. Pakistan provides a different but equally important example of how interpretation and power shape outcomes. As shown on the slide, the 2018 Transgender Persons Act was a major step forward because it allowed individuals to legally identify their gender and access rights related to documentation, employment, and protection from discrimination. However, the slide also points out that in 2013, the federal Sharia court ruled that the key parts of this law were inconsistent with its interpretation of Islamic principles. This is where the instability becomes clear. Even though legal recognition was established, it was not secure. When religious interpretation becomes institutionalized through courts, it can reshape or even reverse legal protections. So Pakistan demonstrates that legal recognition is not a final outcome, but an ongoing process that can be challenged and redefined. And this reinforces that key idea on the slide. Legal recognition alone does not guarantee stability, but instead, rights depend on who has the authority to interpret religion and how that interpretation is applied through political and legal systems. Bangladesh offers another important example, especially when thinking about the difference between recognition and lived experience. As the slide explains, the government officially recognized a third gender category, which might initially appear as progress. This recognition created visibility and allowed transgender and hijra individuals to be included in official documents and policies. But the slide also highlights that this recognition came with serious limitations. In some cases, individuals were subjected to invasive medical examinations to verify their identity, which shows how recognition can still be tied to control and suspicion. This raises a deeper question that the slide points to. What does recognition actually mean if people are still treated as bodies that need to be inspected or verified? So Bangladesh helps separate the idea of symbolic recognition from actual dignity. A legal category can exist, but without respected practices and social acceptance, individuals may still face exclusion and harm. This again supports my thesis because it shows that outcomes are shaped not just by religious ideas, but by how those ideas are implemented through institutions and social practices. This slide shifts the focus from how transgender Muslims are interpreted to how they actively practice their faith. As the slide explains, in Indonesia, some transgender women, often referred to as a waria, have created their own religious spaces. One key example mentioned on the slide is the Al-Fatah Pesantren, which is an Islamic school and community space where waria can pray, learn, and engage in religious life. This is important because it challenges the assumption that transgender Muslims exist outside of Islam. Instead, it shows that they are actively participating in and shaping religious practice. As the slide emphasizes, this represents religious agency. Transgender Muslims are not only being debated by scholars or regulated by institutions, but are also creating spaces where faith and identity coexist. This reinforces my argument that Islam is not a fixed system, but something that is lived, interpreted, and practiced in many ways, that they may actually create institutions where they can belong. When looking at Malaysia, we see how religious interpretation becomes embedded in law in everyday life. Malaysia combines religious authority, state law, and public regulation of gender expression. This slide points out that rulings like the National Fatwa Council's position on sex reassignment surgery and state-level Sharia laws shape how transgender individuals are treated. This means that theology is not just an abstract idea, but something that can be enforced through policing, court cases, and regulations around appearance and behavior, like in the previous slides. This specific slide emphasizes how Islamic law appears in everyday life through interactions with institutions like courts and laws. When looking to diasporic contexts like Canada, where transgender Muslims navigate a different but still complex set of challenges. In this slide, it explains how when even outside Muslim majority societies in the Middle East, individuals still deal with pressures from family, religious communities, racism, Islamophobia, and expectations within LGBTQ spaces. This slide also highlights that faith can still be a source of resilience. Studies show that some transgender Muslims interpret Islam as connected to justice and support for the oppressed. It is important because it challenges the idea that leaving a Muslim majority context automatically resolves conflict. Instead, this slide suggests that belonging must be negotiated across multiple forms of marginalization, showing that identity and faith remain deeply interconnected. Against the saving narrative. This slide introduces a critical perspective on how transgender Muslims are often represented in Western discourse. This slide explains that there is a narrative around saving queer and transgender Muslims and frames them as victims who need to be rescued from Islam. However, this framing is problematic because it ignores local context and erases the agency of transgender Muslims themselves. The slide emphasizes that this perspective can reinforce colonial assumptions, where Western models of acceptance are treated as the only valid path. Instead, as the slide suggests, a better approach is to focus on how individuals define safety, dignity, and faith within their own context. This pushes to the audience to reflect on their own assumptions and consider where they are truly listening to lived experience. This is also very, very apparent when it comes to women in Islam, as they are viewed as oppressed when wearing hijabs. And hijabs are usually revered as a religious experience that women take pride in practicing in, as it brings them closer to God. Same religion, different outcomes. This slide brings together all of the case studies to show the bigger pattern. As the slide outlines, the same religious tradition produces very different outcomes across regions like Iran, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Malaysia. Each example reveals something different. In Iran, recognition comes through medical and state certification. In Pakistan, legal rights are challenged by religious courts, and while in Bangladesh, recognition does not guarantee dignity. In Indonesia, transgender Muslims create their own religious spaces. And in Malaysia, law regulates gender expression in everyday life. This slide emphasizes that these comparisons turns the thesis into evidence. If Islam had one fixed response, you would see all of these areas treating transgender Muslims the same. These outcomes would look the same, but they do not. Instead, the differences show that Islam is interpreted through institutions like law, medicine, and culture, which shape how people actually experience identity and belonging in different ways and different areas. What the research reveals. The biggest insight from this project is that transgender Muslims' experience cannot be reduced to a conflict between Islam and identity. The real conflict is over interpretation, authority, and whose lives are considered legitimate evidence. Muslims are often required to narrate and prove themselves to doctors, families, and religious leaders and institutions. This shows that recognition is not just about identity, but about being believed and understood within systems of power. So the key question becomes whose interpretation has authority and whose lived experience is ignored. Conclusion: Islam as a living ethical tradition. Transgender Muslim experiences are complex, diverse, and context dependent, like I went over in this presentation. My project shows that Islam is not simply oppressive or accepting by nature, but is lived and interpreted through people, institutions, and histories. This slide also emphasizes that the same tradition can produce exclusion, conditional recognition, or affirming spaces depending on how it is interpreted. This reinforces the central argument of the project. And I want to end with the question on the slide. Who has the authority to turn religious interpretation into either exclusion or affirmation? This question matters because the future of these debates depend not only on religious texts, but who is trusted to interpret them and whose dignity those interpretations protect. In my opinion, I have no idea who it belongs to, but if I was to choose, I would rather be comfortable with my family if I was put into that situation over scholarly or governmental influence. But I know that it is a complicated subject and it is not black and white as we went over this presentation. These are the works that I used for my research. I do recommend that you look into these as well because I learned so much about this topic. First, I want to thank you for listening, and I hope this presentation has challenged some assumptions and shown that transgender Muslim experience cannot be reduced to a single narrative. Instead, they reveal how interpretation, authority, and context shape religious meaning in real and powerful ways. I'd be happy to hear any questions or reflections, especially around the final question about this project. I do recommend that each individual who views this video to look deeply into Islam. I myself am Roman Catholic, and I did have some misinterpretations about this religion. But taking this course has really opened my eyes and cleared some of the misconceptions that I would have never learned about if I hadn't taken this course. Again, I thank you for listening to this presentation, and I hope you have a wonderful day.